Did you ever wonder how the desserts your family loved could end up being illegal now? These sweet treats filled kitchens with comfort, celebration, and flavors nobody questioned. And if the recipes we trusted carried dangers hidden in every bite, what else have we been savoring without knowing? Red dye. Number 2. Maraschino cherries were the crowning jewel of every ice cream sundae and soda fountain treat in the 1970s. That impossibly bright red glow made desserts look more festive, more delicious than anything nature could produce on its own. Kids watched with wide eyes as soda jerks dropped cherries into floats, the red bleeding into vanilla foam like tiny fireworks dissolving in cream. Parents bought jars of them for home, placing them atop whipped cream, pound cake, and anything needing color. What nobody realized was that the dye responsible for that stunning color was quietly accumulating in bodies across the country. Red dye number 2 was designed to make food irresistible, and for decades it did exactly that. It took years before researchers discovered a troubling connection between the dye and cancer in laboratory animals. The findings shook families who had served these cherries at countless birthday parties and holiday dinners. By 1976, regulators banned the dye entirely, pulling that beloved red from shelves. What once symbolized celebration now carried a warning that color and danger sometimes share the same glow. Cyclamate-sweetened diet gelatin was one of the most exciting innovations for families watching their weight in the 1970s. The promise was irresistible. Enjoy the wiggling, colorful fun of gelatin desserts without a calorie of guilt. Mothers served it at dinner parties, molding it into elaborate shapes that sparkled under dining room lights. Children loved the bright colors and the way gelatin shimmered on their spoons. Eaters felt like they had finally found a loophole, a way to have dessert without consequences. Cyclamate made this possible, replacing sugar with a compound hundreds of times sweeter that dissolved invisibly. But behind that sweetness was a growing concern nobody wanted to believe. Researchers discovered troubling links between cyclamate and bladder tumors, and suddenly the miracle sweetener became a nightmare. In 1970, the government banned cyclamate entirely, yanking it from every product and leaving dieters scrambling for alternatives. Families who had filled refrigerators with sugar-free treats were stunned to learn that the thing promising health had been quietly threatening it. That ban still stands, a reminder that shortcuts do not always lead somewhere safe. Homemade raw egg ice cream was a treasured summer ritual in the 1970s, the kind of family activity that turned hot afternoons into something unforgettable. Parents cracked fresh eggs into the bowl, whisking them into rich custard that would become the creamiest ice cream anyone could imagine. Kids took turns cranking the wooden handle on the churn, counting minutes until they could taste the first frozen spoonful. The eggs gave the ice cream its velvet texture. That thick richness store-bought versions never matched. Nobody worried about bacteria because eggs came from trusted sources, sometimes backyard chickens or local farms where neighbors knew every hen by name. It felt wholesome and impossibly delicious. But salmonella hid inside some of those shells, invisible and undetectable by taste or smell. Families who had eaten raw egg desserts for generations found themselves reading headlines about outbreaks and urgent warnings. Regulations tightened, pasteurization became standard, and casual use of raw eggs in homemade desserts became something health codes no longer allowed. That ice cream tasted like summer, but it carries the memory of a risk nobody saw coming. Sassafras root beer floats were a beloved treat in the 1970s, combining fizzy sweetness with scoops of vanilla ice cream in glasses that seemed to overflow with pure joy. The root beer had a distinctive flavor, earthy and complex, that came from sassafras root bark, an ingredient used in American recipes for over a century. Kids lined up at soda fountains and corner drugstores, watching foam rise and fall as cold ice cream met dark liquid. Families kept bottles home for special occasions, and the smell alone brought back memories of summer afternoons. That signature taste felt like tradition itself, something passed down through generations without question. But inside the root bark was safrole, and researchers discovered it caused liver damage and cancer in laboratory studies. The findings forced regulators to act, banning saffron from all food and stripping sassafras of its place in root beer recipes. Modern versions use artificial flavoring that tries to mimic the original, but anyone who tasted the real thing knows the difference. Those old floats carried a flavor that no longer exists legally, a sweetness tied to a danger nobody imagined while sipping through striped paper straws. Lead-glazed ceramic candy dishes sat on coffee tables and dining room sideboards throughout the 1970s, holding peppermints, chocolates, and holiday treats guests reached for without hesitation. These dishes were beautiful, often hand-painted with intricate designs or finished with glossy coatings that made colors pop under lamplight. Families displayed them proudly because they looked elegant, the kind of heirloom meant to last generations. Grandmothers filled them every Christmas, and children knew exactly which dish held the best candies. What nobody understood was that the glaze creating those gorgeous finishes contained lead, a toxic metal that leached slowly into anything sugary placed inside. Every lemon drop, every piece of chocolate sitting for days absorbed traces of lead no one could see or taste. Over time, researchers connected decorative ceramics to dangerous exposure levels, especially in children who grabbed handfuls of sweets. Regulators eventually cracked down on lead glazes, banning them from any product meant to touch food. Families packed away beloved dishes, uncertain whether the beauty they treasured had quietly poisoned the treats served with such love. Violet number 1. Purple frosting made birthday cakes in the 1970s look like something from a fantasy world, with swirls and flowers in shades so vivid they seemed to glow under party lights. Bakers loved this dye because it produced a rich, stable purple that did not fade or bleed the way natural colorings did. Parents ordered custom cakes knowing the purple roses would photograph beautifully and make children feel like royalty. Kids scraped frosting off with their fingers, not caring about the cake beneath because that brilliant purple sweetness was the real prize. The color showed up in candies too, coating gumdrops and lollipops with an intensity that captured every child's attention. But behind that glamorous shade was a synthetic compound researchers studied with growing concern. By 1973, evidence suggested violet number 1 might contribute to cancer, and regulators moved swiftly to ban it from all food products. Birthday parties continued, but cakes looked different afterward, missing that particular purple that once seemed so magical. The color was never forgotten, even as families learned to distrust it, a reminder that brightness sometimes hides darkness. Brominated vegetable oil citrus sherbet was a summer staple in the 1970s, offering tangy, refreshing treats that cooled down hot afternoons and made gatherings feel complete. The sherbet came in bright orange, lemon, and lime flavors that tasted almost more citrus than real fruit, with smooth texture melting perfectly on the tongue. Kids loved scooping it into bowls or pressing it between cookies to make sandwiches dripping down their fingers. What made those flavors stay evenly distributed, so consistently vibrant, was brominated vegetable oil. This emulsifier kept citrus flavoring from separating, ensuring every bite delivered the same tangy punch. Families trusted it because it appeared in countless products without warning labels, but bromine accumulates in the body over time, and researchers linked it to thyroid problems and neurological issues that could not be ignored. States began banning brominated vegetable oil, forcing manufacturers to reformulate recipes unchanged for decades. The sherbet still exists, but the version families remember contains something modern regulations refuse to allow. That refreshing sweetness carries a story of convenience outweighing caution. Unpasteurized milk puddings were a creamy indulgence in the 1970s, made from fresh farm milk that came straight from the dairy without processing to alter its richness. Families near farms prized this milk for its thick texture and sweet, grassy flavor that store-bought versions could not replicate. Mothers heated it slowly on the stove, stirring in sugar, eggs, and vanilla until pudding thickened into something luxurious. Children scraped bowls clean, asking for seconds before the first serving cooled. The pudding tasted like the countryside, fresh and honest and free from anything artificial. People trusted raw milk because it came from neighbors, from animals grazing in pastures, from a process that felt more natural than factories. But unpasteurized milk harbors dangerous bacteria that pasteurization was designed to kill. Outbreaks of illness traced back to raw dairy forced regulators to restrict its sale, especially in commercial food production. Today, selling unpasteurized milk puddings would violate health codes in most places, turning a beloved comfort food into something considered too risky. That simple dessert now represents an era when trust outweighed testing. Coumarin-flavored vanilla cakes were the pride of home bakers in the 1970s, delivering rich, warm sweetness that made every slice taste like something from a professional bakery. Coumarin was a synthetic compound mimicking vanilla beans at a fraction of the cost, allowing families to create elaborate layer cakes without spending a fortune on pure extract. The smell alone filled kitchens with comforting aroma everyone associated with celebration. Bakers trusted it because it performed beautifully, blending into batters without bitter aftertaste. Children licked beaters clean, never questioning what gave the batter its delicious sweetness. But coumarin did more than flavor desserts. Researchers discovered it caused liver damage when consumed regularly, building up in the body and creating problems emerging only after years of exposure. The FDA banned coumarin from food products once evidence became undeniable, forcing bakers to switch to approved vanilla flavorings that cost more but carried no hidden risks. The cakes still taste wonderful, but that particular warmth from old recipes disappeared along with the compound that made them possible. Sweetness and danger had shared the same spoon. Saffron-flavored licorice candy was a childhood favorite in the 1970s, with distinctive taste that lingered on the tongue long after the last piece was gone. The black twists and drops had depth of flavor that modern licorice struggles to match, something earthy and slightly mysterious that made kids reach for more. Penny candy stores kept jars on low shelves where children could see and smell treats waiting for their coins. The compound responsible for that signature taste was saffron, the same substance found in sassafras root that gave traditional root beer its character. For decades, nobody questioned whether something familiar could be harmful because it had always been part of the candy landscape. But saffron is a known carcinogen, capable of causing liver tumors with prolonged exposure. When regulators banned it from food and beverages, licorice makers scrambled to find alternatives replicating the beloved flavor. Versions sold today use anise and other approved ingredients, but longtime fans insist something essential was lost. That old licorice represented a taste no longer existing legally, a sweetness wrapped in danger nobody recognized until science demanded change. Yellow number 1 and number 2 cake decorations made birthday celebrations in the 1970s glow with sunshine colors that seemed impossible to achieve naturally. Bakers relied on these synthetic dyes to create bright yellow frosting flowers and cheerful trimmings that popped against white buttercream. Children's cakes featured smiling suns and lemon-colored decorations that made every celebration feel warm. Parents trusted these colors because they appeared in everything from store-bought treats to bakery masterpieces. The yellows were stable, vibrant, and easy to work with, favorites among decorators wanting consistent results. What nobody questioned was what happened when those brilliant pigments entered the body over years of parties. Researchers eventually linked these dyes to allergic reactions and health concerns that raised alarm bells. Regulators banned both yellow number 1 and yellow number 2, forcing manufacturers to reformulate products relying on these colors for decades. The sunny decorations crowning countless cakes disappeared from approved ingredient lists. Different yellow dyes have taken their place, but the original shades defining 70s celebrations no longer exist in legal form. Potassium bromate flour pastries were the secret behind the fluffiest croissants, perfectly risen dinner rolls, and lightest pie crusts families enjoyed in the 1970s. Bakers considered this additive essential because it strengthened dough, improved texture, and created ideal crumb structure. Commercial bakeries and home cooks alike used bromated flour without hesitation, trusting that anything sold so widely must be safe. The pastries came out golden and beautiful, with layers separating cleanly and crusts shattering just right under a fork. Nobody reading ingredient labels thought twice about potassium bromate because it sounded technical, the kind of thing experts had surely tested. But researchers discovered bromate could cause cancer when consumed in certain amounts, and international health agencies began sounding alarms. Countries around the world banned the additive from flour production, forcing bakeries to find alternatives achieving similar results without risks. The United States moved slower, but awareness grew as studies mounted. Those perfect pastries from the 70s owed their texture to something the modern world considers too dangerous for the breakfast table. DDT residue fruit pies carried traces of one of the most controversial pesticides ever used in American agriculture, and families in the 1970s served them without knowing what lingered in the filling. Orchards had been sprayed with DDT for decades, protecting apple trees and cherry blossoms from insects threatening harvests. The chemical worked brilliantly, saving crops and keeping fruit affordable for families who baked pies every weekend. Mothers rolled out crusts, filled them with sliced apples or cherries, and placed them proudly on dinner tables. The fruit looked perfect, tasted sweet, and showed no visible sign of what had been sprayed on it months before picking. But DDT does not wash away easily, and it accumulates in the body, building up in tissues and passing through food chains in ways scientists were only beginning to understand. When researchers connected DDT to cancer, reproductive problems, and environmental devastation, the outcry was immediate. The government banned DDT in 1972, but residues lingered in soil and fruit for years afterward. Those beloved pies represented an era when progress meant trusting chemicals nobody fully understood. Butter yellow margarine cookies were a staple of home baking in the 1970s, made with margarine dyed to look as rich and golden as real butter. The color came from a synthetic compound called butter yellow, designed to make margarine appealing to shoppers who associated that golden hue with quality. Families creamed the colored margarine into sugar, mixed it with flour, and baked batches of cookies looking just as appetizing as anything made with expensive butter. Children helped press fork marks into peanut butter cookies and dropped spoonfuls of dough onto baking sheets, never suspecting anything about the bright yellow fat in the bowl. Bakers trusted the color because it appeared in margarine sold everywhere, a product marketed as healthier and affordable. But butter yellow was eventually identified as a carcinogen, capable of causing tumors in laboratory animals. Regulators banned it from food products once evidence became clear, forcing margarine makers to find safer alternatives. The cookies families baked with such care contained a hidden ingredient science later condemned. That golden color had masked something darker all along. Calamus root penny candy was a nostalgic treat in the 1970s, flavored with extract used in confections for generations before anyone questioned its safety. Children visited corner stores with coins clutched in fists, pointing at jars filled with candies carrying that distinctive, slightly spicy sweetness Calamus provided. The flavor felt old-fashioned, like something grandparents remembered from their own childhoods. Parents bought bags without hesitation because they seemed wholesome compared to modern artificial flavors. Calamus had been used in medicines, beverages, and treats for so long that nobody imagined it could be harmful. But when researchers tested calamus root extract on laboratory animals, they discovered it caused tumors and serious health effects that could not be ignored. The FDA banned calamus as a food additive, pulling it from candy recipes across the industry. The penny candies delighting generations suddenly disappeared from store shelves, replaced by versions using approved ingredients. That familiar flavor became illegal, a taste belonging only to memory and an era less cautious about what sweetness might contain. Oil of wintergreen hard candies were intensely flavored treats that burned pleasantly on the tongue and left breath smelling crisp for hours. In the 1970s, these candies sat in glass jars at drugstore counters, sold loose by the piece to anyone with sense to spare. Children loved the strong sensation, making their eyes water slightly and mouths feel cool even on hot summer days. The flavor came from methyl salicylate, a compound concentrated enough to be genuinely dangerous in large amounts but sold freely in candy form without warnings. Parents handed these treats to children during car rides, after doctor visits, or as rewards for good behavior, never imagining the flavoring itself could cause harm. But methyl salicylate is toxic when consumed in quantity, and reports of poisonings, particularly among children eating too many, eventually forced regulators to act. Restrictions tightened around products containing concentrated wintergreen oil, and candy makers reformulated recipes to reduce risk. Those powerful little candies from the 70s contained something far more potent than anyone buying them realized. Tonka bean vanilla cookies were a specialty treat in the 1970s, prized by bakers wanting something more exotic than ordinary vanilla extract. The Tonka bean offered a complex flavor profile, part vanilla, part almond, part something mysterious that elevated simple sugar cookies into something memorable. Home bakers who discovered these beans guarded their sources jealously, shaving the dark seeds into doughs that perfumed entire kitchens with intoxicating sweetness. The cookies tasted sophisticated, the kind of treat you might find at a European bakery rather than an American kitchen. Children devoured them without knowing why they tasted different, only that they wanted more. But Tonka beans contain coumarin, the same compound causing liver damage when used in other food products. The FDA banned Tonka beans from food use once researchers connected that alluring flavor to serious health consequences. Bakers who treasured their secret ingredient suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of food safety law. The cookies that once impressed guests became impossible to make legally, their distinctive taste now forbidden by regulations protecting public health. Raw milk cheesecake was a rich, tangy indulgence in the 1970s, made by bakers insisting that unpasteurized milk cheese produced superior flavor and texture. The cheesecakes came out dense and creamy, with a slight edge pasteurized versions simply could not match. Families served them at holiday gatherings and special celebrations where only the best desserts would do. Home cooks sought out farmers selling fresh cheese made from milk never heated, believing the natural product was healthier than anything processed in factories. The taste validated their beliefs, each slice delivering richness that seemed to justify the extra effort of finding those sources. But cheese made from unpasteurized milk can harbor dangerous bacteria unless aged for at least 60 days, a requirement many fresh cheeses never met. Health officials traced outbreaks of serious illness back to raw milk products, and regulations tightened around their production. Today, the cheesecakes families remember would require properly aged cheese or pasteurized milk to be legal. That creamy perfection came with risks the era chose to ignore. Sulfite preserved candied fruits were the jewels of holiday fruitcakes in the 1970s, glowing red, green, and gold in slices studding every loaf with festive color. The sulfites kept these fruits bright and fresh-looking for months, allowing bakers to buy them well in advance. Families followed recipes passed down through generations, mixing candied cherries, citron, and pineapple into batters, becoming the dense, boozy cakes everyone either loved or pretended to love. The colors never faded, the fruits never dried out, and the cakes lasted seemingly forever on pantry shelves. Nobody questioned what kept those fruits so unnaturally vibrant, because preservatives were simply part of modern food production. But sulfites triggered severe allergic reactions in sensitive individuals, causing breathing difficulties and dangerous symptoms, sending some people to emergency rooms. When the connection became undeniable, regulators required warning labels and banned sulfites from certain foods entirely. The candied fruits that made fruitcakes colorful had been causing harm nobody recognized until bodies started reacting to what tradition taught everyone to trust. Sodium nitrite preserved fruitcakes were holiday traditions in the 1970s, dense loaves packed with dried fruits and nuts that families aged for weeks before serving. The sodium nitrite helped these cakes maintain color and prevented bacterial growth during the long curing process fruitcake recipes demanded. Bakers soaked creations in brandy or rum, wrapped them in cheesecloth, and stored them in cool cellars where flavors developed into something complex. The preservatives seemed essential, keeping cakes safe to eat even after sitting for periods that would spoil ordinary baked goods. Families exchanged these fruitcakes as gifts, proud of recipes handed down through generations. But sodium nitrite forms compounds in the body that researchers linked to cancer risk, particularly when consumed regularly over time. Regulations tightened around its use in food products, and modern fruitcake recipes rely on different preservation methods or shorter storage times. The cakes your grandmother aged in her basement contained something science now treats with serious caution. That holiday tradition carried hidden costs nobody calculated while slicing another piece. Lead-soldered canned fruit cocktail was a pantry staple in the 1970s. Colorful cans filled with peaches, pears, cherries, and grapes swimming in sweet syrup that families spooned over ice cream or cake. The cans stacked neatly in cupboards, ready to become quick desserts whenever company arrived or children begged for something sweet. Nobody examined the seams holding those cans together or wondered what metal might be leaching into the liquid inside. Lead solder was standard in canning for decades, a cheap and effective way to seal containers sitting on shelves for months. The acidic syrup slowly dissolved traces of lead from those seams, contaminating the fruit families trusted completely. Children ate it straight from the can, mothers added it to gelatin molds, and grandmothers served it at holiday gatherings. When researchers connected lead exposure to developmental problems and serious health issues, the canning industry faced demands for change. Regulations banned lead solder from food containers, but countless families had already consumed decades of contaminated fruit. Those innocent desserts carried a metallic secret. Carbon tetrachloride processed chocolates carried residue from one of the most toxic solvents ever used in food manufacturing. In the 1970s, some chocolate producers used carbon tetrachloride to extract cocoa butter or clean equipment, believing the solvent evaporated before products reached consumers. The chocolates looked perfect, tasted rich, and gave no hint of what had touched them during production. Families bought boxes for holidays and special occasions, never imagining factory processes could leave behind something dangerous. Children unwrapped foil-covered pieces with excitement, savoring each bite without knowing what traces might linger. Carbon tetrachloride damages the liver, kidneys, and nervous system even in small amounts, and workers in facilities using it suffered the worst effects. When health authorities recognized the danger, regulations banned the solvent from any process involving food. Chocolate makers switched to safer methods, but products from that era represented an industry prioritizing efficiency over caution. Those sweet treats had passed through something toxic before reaching the candy dish. Diacetyl butter-flavored candies delivered that rich, creamy taste everyone associated with movie theater popcorn and homemade caramel. In the 1970s, candy makers used diacetyl to create butter flavoring so convincing that children could not tell the difference from real dairy. The compound showed up in butterscotch drops, caramel chews, toffees, and countless treats promising buttery indulgence without the cost of actual butter. Families bought bags for car trips, holiday stockings, and after-school rewards, trusting that something sold widely must be safe. The flavor was addictive, that unmistakable richness coating the tongue and leaving behind comforting warmth. But workers in factories producing diacetyl began developing serious lung disease, a condition so distinctive it became known as popcorn lung. Researchers connected the compound to respiratory damage that could be permanent. Regulations tightened around diacetyl use, and manufacturers quietly reformulated their products. The butter flavor families loved had been causing harm in ways nobody imagined while unwrapping another golden candy. Chloroform-flavored cough drop. Candy was a strange relic from an era when pharmaceutical ingredients crossed freely into the confectionery world. In the 1970s, some cough drops still contained traces of chloroform, valued for its sweet taste and mild numbing effect that soothed irritated throats. Children sucked on these drops whenever colds arrived, enjoying the unusual flavor that felt both medicinal and pleasant. Parents handed them out freely, believing anything sold in pharmacies and candy shops must be appropriate for young mouths. The numbing sensation seemed to prove the drops were working, doing something real to ease discomfort. But chloroform is a powerful anesthetic with serious health risks, capable of causing liver damage with repeated exposure. When regulators recognized that no amount of chloroform belonged in candy, they banned it from all food products entirely. The cough drops that had soothed generations of sore throats disappeared from shelves, replaced by formulations using safer ingredients. That strange, slightly sweet numbness became a memory of medicine cabinets past. Alar sprayed apple desserts were the center of a nationwide panic that changed how Americans thought about pesticides on their food. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, orchards sprayed Alar on apple trees to regulate growth, improve color, and extend storage life. The apples looked beautiful, stayed crisp longer, and became the foundation for pies, crisps, cobblers, and applesauce families served at every gathering. Children drank apple juice by the gallon, ate applesauce from jars, and devoured slices of warm apple pie without anyone questioning what coated the fruit. Alar seemed like progress, a scientific tool helping farmers produce better crops. But studies suggested the chemical broke down into compounds linked to cancer, particularly concerning for children who consumed more apples relative to their body weight. When findings became public in 1989, panic spread across the country. Schools pulled apple products from cafeterias, parents dumped juice down drains, and apple growers faced devastating losses. The EPA banned Alar, ending an era when desserts carried invisible risks that science was only beginning to understand. Raw egg milkshakes blended fresh at the counter were a protein-packed treat that bodybuilders and health enthusiasts ordered at fast food joints during the 1970s. Some restaurants advertised the addition of raw eggs as a nutritional boost, cracking shells directly into the blender alongside ice cream and flavored syrup. Customers watched the process with satisfaction, believing they were getting something extra that set their shake apart from the standard menu offering. The eggs made the texture richer and the drink feel more substantial, a meal replacement disguised as dessert. But raw eggs carry salmonella bacteria that cooking eliminates, and consuming them uncooked posed a genuine risk that most customers never considered. Outbreaks of salmonella linked to raw egg consumption eventually pushed health departments to ban the practice in commercial food service. Restaurants quietly removed the option from their menus, and the raw egg shake became a relic of an era that treated food safety far more casually. Today, the idea of cracking a raw egg into a fast food blender feels genuinely alarming, though it was once considered a healthy upgrade. Unlimited portion sizes with no calorie caps defined the generous spirit of school cafeterias in the 1980s, where lunch ladies piled food onto trays without measuring or restricting what students received. If you wanted more mashed potatoes, you got more. If the serving of spaghetti looked small, a friendly scoop made it larger. Schools operated on the philosophy that growing children needed fuel, and fuel meant food without limits. Nobody tracked calories because nobody thought calories mattered for kids burning energy on playgrounds. The lunch line moved fast, and portions reflected whatever fit on the tray rather than any nutritional calculation. Some students ate modest amounts while others piled their plates high, and both approaches were accepted. But childhood obesity rates began climbing in ways that alarmed health officials. Studies connected unlimited school portions to eating habits that followed children into adulthood. Federal regulations eventually imposed strict calorie ranges for school meals. Today, portion sizes are measured precisely, and seconds are often impossible to obtain. The abundance that once defined cafeteria culture has been replaced by careful control. Surge soda was the liquid embodiment of the word extreme. Released in the mid-90s as Coca-Cola's answer to Mountain Dew, it came in a neon green can that looked like it could power a skateboard. The drink promised adrenaline in a bottle, an energy boost before energy drinks were even a thing. Every can felt like an invitation to chaos, an explosion of sugar, caffeine, and citrus that hit harder than anything else on the shelf. The ads made you feel like cracking open a Surge could transform an ordinary afternoon into an action movie. For kids growing up in the 90s, drinking one felt like joining a secret club of unstoppable energy. Its marketing screamed rebellion, all graffiti logos, explosions, and kids jumping off rooftops. Every gulp was like tasting citrus chaos. Parents called it caffeinated sugar water, but that only made it cooler. Surge was banned in schools, whispered about like contraband, and adored by every kid who wanted to feel like a daredevil. It was more than soda. It was an attitude, a bright green middle finger to moderation. Even now, people remember that electric buzz, that rush of flavor that somehow felt alive. It wasn't just a drink, it was a moment in time bottled up for a generation that refused to slow down. Surge didn't just wake you up, it woke up an era. And when it vanished in the early 2000s, it left behind an entire generation of nostalgic fans who swore no drink has ever come close. For a moment, Surge wasn't just a beverage. It was the soundtrack to growing up loud. Tuna in oil with crackers was a humble little feast for anyone who needed protein on the cheap. You cracked the can open carefully, drained off the oily liquid as best you could, and scooped the tuna onto saltines like you were preparing hors d'oeuvres. It was salty, fishy, and oddly satisfying. The oil made it richer than water-packed tuna, and that mattered when you had nothing else on the plate. Sometimes there was mayonnaise to mix in, sometimes there was just mustard or pickle juice, and sometimes it was straight from the can with a spoon. Kids learned to like it, or at least tolerate it, because it showed up in lunchboxes more often than not, wrapped in wax paper, paired with a juice box or maybe just tap water. Adults appreciated it for its shelf life. It never went bad, and it did not require cooking. You could open a can and feel like you were doing all right, even if the fridge was close to empty. It was the kind of snack that kept you moving, gave you a little fuel, and reminded you that even the simplest things could hit the spot. Coal tar dyes colored the pickles, relishes, and specialty sauces served at fast food restaurants during the 1970s, giving condiments that vibrant artificial brightness that made them pop against buns and patties. The dyes were cheap, stable, and produced colors that natural ingredients could never match, so manufacturers used them freely. Customers squeezed bright yellow mustard and neon green relish onto their hot dogs without wondering where those intense hues came from. Children were especially drawn to the vivid colors, associating brightness with flavor. But coal tar dyes were derived from petroleum, and researchers began questioning whether ingesting them regularly posed health risks. Studies linked certain dyes to hyperactivity in children, allergic reactions, and potential carcinogenic effects. Regulators responded by banning some dyes outright and requiring stricter testing, forcing food manufacturers to reformulate products that had relied on artificial color for decades. Today, many fast food chains advertise natural colorings, a shift driven by consumer demand that traces directly back to concerns about the petroleum-based dyes that once seemed harmless. Partially hydrogenated vegetable shortening was the invisible ingredient that made everything in the cafeteria taste better, richer, and more satisfying than it had any right to be. Cooks used it for frying, baking, and greasing every pan that produced the foods children loved most. The shortening came in large containers beside industrial stoves, scooped out by the cupful and melted into recipes passed down through decades of school food service. Nobody questioned it because nobody knew there was anything to question. Trans fats extended shelf life, improved texture, and cost far less than butter or other alternatives. The cookies were flakier, the pie crusts more tender, and the fried foods crispier because of this single ingredient that touched nearly everything on the menu. But scientists discovered that trans fats raised bad cholesterol while lowering the good kind, creating a cardiovascular danger that lurked in every bite. When evidence became undeniable, regulators banned partially hydrogenated oils entirely. School kitchens had to reformulate everything, replacing the shortening that had defined cafeteria cooking for generations. The foods remain, but they taste different now. Canned fruit cocktail was sweet, soft, and a little bit syrupy, but it felt like dessert. You opened the can with a crank or pull tab and dumped it into a bowl, syrup and all. The pieces were tiny cubes of pears, peaches, grapes, and that one red cherry that everyone fought over. It came chilled or room temperature. It was just fruit, but it felt like a treat. You would dig through the whole can just to find that cherry, even if it was half mushed by the time you got to it. The syrup was so sweet it made your teeth ache, but no one poured it down the drain. You sopped it up with bread, drank it straight, or saved it for the baby if you were feeling generous. Even if the fruit was soft and looked like it had been in the can since the war, it still counted as something good. And it was one of the only desserts poor families could keep on the shelf without worrying it would go bad. Even when the texture was mushy and the grapes were suspiciously pale, it still made your spoon feel special. You could add whipped topping if you had it, or serve it over dry cake to make it feel like celebration. For poor families, it was a go-to for school lunches, Sunday dinners, or nights when something sweet was needed to lift the mood. It lasted forever on the shelf and came cheap if you bought the store brand label. You might rinse the syrup off to cut the sugar, or pour it over cottage cheese to pretend it was fancy. But most of the time, you just grabbed a fork and ate it cold right out of the can. Because in a world of hard choices and tight budgets, Fruit Cocktail reminded you that sweetness could still find a way in. There was a time when buying imported cheese felt like sophistication itself. In the 1970s, raw milk cheeses, creamy, tangy, and full of character, became the mark of a true gourmet. They were made by hand, aged in cool cellars, and packed with rich, earthy flavor that pasteurized versions could never match. But the same bacteria that gave them depth also brought danger. Listeria, Salmonella, and E. coli lurked in the unpasteurized milk, invisible threats wrapped in golden wax. The Food and Drug Administration drew a line. Any cheese made from raw milk must be aged at least 60 days before sale to allow harmful bacteria to die off. That single rule shut the door on countless beloved imports. Cheeses from France, Italy, and Switzerland vanished from American markets, replaced by safer, blander versions. For many, it felt like losing a link to old-world culture, a trade of flavor for security. Even today, food lovers debate the rule, whether it protects us or just keeps us from tasting something truly real. But for those who remember that first bite of brie so soft it nearly melted on the tongue, the ban marked more than a change in law. It marked the end of an era when danger could still taste divine. Lard-based pie crusts dominated the dessert menus of fast food restaurants during the 1970s, giving cherry pies, apple turnovers, and fried fruit pastries that flaky, tender texture customers craved. Rendered pig fat was the baking industry's secret weapon, producing crusts that shattered perfectly with each bite and held fillings without getting soggy. Restaurants fried pies in the same lard, doubling down on a flavor profile that felt rich, satisfying, and undeniably delicious. Families finished meals with these treats, not realizing they were consuming significant amounts of saturated fat in a single dessert. The crusts were golden, the fillings were sweet, and the whole experience felt like a reward after a long day. But as research connected saturated fat to heart disease, lard fell out of favor across the food industry. Fast food chains switched to vegetable shortenings and eventually to formulations designed to reduce trans fats as well. The original lard-crusted pies disappeared from menus, replaced by versions that tasted different enough for longtime customers to notice. Today, those rich, flaky pastries exist only in memory and occasional nostalgic recreations. Sugary breakfast cereals served as main courses were a strange but beloved part of school nutrition in the 1980s, appearing on lunch trays as if morning and midday had merged. Schools offered boxes of Frosted Flakes and Cocoa Puffs alongside milk cartons, letting students pour their own bowls right in the cafeteria. It seemed like a treat, a break from the usual mystery meats and overcooked vegetables. Kids loved the crunch, the sweetness, and the feeling that they were getting away with something reserved for Saturday mornings. Parents rarely questioned it because cereal was considered wholesome, fortified with vitamins the boxes proudly advertised. Nobody stopped to calculate how much sugar hid inside each colorful serving. The milk turned pastel shades as children slurped the last sweet drops, unaware of the nutritional void they had consumed. But when added sugar limits became part of federal school meal standards, those cereal boxes disappeared almost overnight. The sugar content far exceeded what regulators now permit. Today, breakfast cereals in schools must meet strict sugar caps that leave no room for the frosted favorites that once made lunch feel like a party. Powdered milk was not a luxury, it was a necessity. It came in a cardboard box or a giant tin, and you mixed it with cold water, hoping for the best. You stirred and stirred, watching white clumps float around like tiny regrets, and finally let it sit until the bubbles went down. It never tasted like real milk. It was chalky, thin, and had a weird aftertaste you just got used to. But when you were poor, you drank it anyway, on cereal, in recipes, or straight from the cup when there was no alternative. You told yourself it was milk, because saying otherwise made breakfast a little harder to swallow. Kids could tell the difference instantly, but they drank it too because it was better than dry cereal. Sometimes mom stretched it by mixing it half and half with what was left of real milk. Sometimes it was all you had. The pitcher sat in the fridge, usually with a label saying, "Drink me," or "Use this first." No one fought over it, but it was always empty by week's end. It made mac and cheese possible. It kept mashed potatoes creamy. It filled in the blanks when everything else was running low. And it reminded you, every time you took a sip, that making do meant being creative with what you had. Salisbury steak drenched in high-sodium gravy was the kind of cafeteria comfort food that made even picky eaters clean their trays in the 1980s. The oval-shaped patties arrived swimming in thick brown sauce that glistened under serving line lights, looking like something from a home-cooked dinner. Kids loved how the gravy soaked into everything it touched, turning mashed potatoes into a savory puddle and making even overcooked vegetables taste acceptable. Lunch ladies ladled it generously, sometimes giving extra to students who asked politely. The saltiness was part of the appeal, that rich, almost addictive flavor that made you want to scrape every last drop from your tray. Nobody questioned the sodium content because nobody thought about sodium at all. It was simply good food that filled bellies and kept students happy through afternoon classes. But when nutritionists examined what schools actually served, the sodium levels in that beloved gravy raised immediate alarms. Federal guidelines now cap sodium strictly, and the gravy that once defined Salisbury Steak Day has been reformulated into something far less indulgent. Jiffy corn muffin mix came in a little blue and white box that looked more like a school project than food packaging, but what it made could feed a family. For a few cents and some water or milk and one egg if you had it, you got a dozen golden muffins that made the house smell like someone had been baking all day. You mixed it with a fork, baked it in muffin tins, or just poured the whole thing into a cake pan. They came out a little sweet, a little crumbly, and always a little undercooked in the middle if you were in a rush. Sometimes they stuck to the pan, sometimes they came out perfect. But either way, they got eaten. You dipped them in beans, crumbled them into chili, slathered them with margarine, or drizzled a little honey if you had a jar hidden in the back of the cupboard. It was the kind of food that made people feel full and satisfied, even when the rest of the meal was thin. Moms kept a few boxes on hand at all times, and when dinner needed stretching, out came the Jiffy mix. It was foolproof, fast and friendly to even the tightest grocery list. The smell alone could lift your mood. It said, "Something's cooking," even if the main dish was still figuring itself out. Saccharin packets without cancer warning labels sat in small glass dispensers on every fast food table during the early 1970s, offered freely to customers who wanted sweetness without sugar. Dieters shook the little pink packets into their coffee and iced tea, believing they had found a guilt-free solution to their cravings. The artificial sweetener had been around for decades, trusted by millions, and nobody imagined that regulators were about to require warning labels on every package. When studies suggested a possible link to bladder cancer in laboratory animals, the government mandated labels that shocked consumers. Suddenly, something that felt harmless came with fine print that made people pause before tearing open the packet. Fast food restaurants continued offering saccharin, but customers now faced an uncomfortable choice with every cup of coffee. The warning labels remained in place for years, creating confusion around a sweetener that many still use daily. Today, the labels are gone after further research softened the concerns. But the memory of that regulatory whiplash lingers as a reminder that approved additives can fall under sudden suspicion. Sizzlean was supposed to be the future of breakfast. Marketed in the 1970s as better than bacon, It promised the same smoky flavor with less fat and cholesterol. Commercials showed smiling families flipping perfect strips on the stove, proud to be eating healthier. But Sizzlean was not exactly what it claimed. It was a mix of pork and beef blended with artificial flavorings and fillers that barely qualified as real meat. Over time, new labeling laws and stricter regulations revealed that its marketing had been misleading. The product was pulled and Sizzlean quietly faded away. For those who remember it, the name still carries a strange nostalgia, half comfort, half caution. It was a glimpse into an era when we trusted packaging more than ingredients and believed that science could reinvent even bacon. Some memories sizzle out, others linger just long enough to remind us how good intentions can sometimes turn synthetic. Kool-Aid and sugary fruit drinks flowed freely through school cafeterias in the 1980s, filling pitchers with bright colors that looked like liquid candy. Kids grabbed cups without hesitation, pouring glasses of red punch or grape drink that contained almost no actual fruit. The sweetness was intense, the colors vivid, and the appeal undeniable to young taste buds raised on similar drinks at home. Schools offered these beverages because they were cheap, easy to prepare, and popular enough to keep students hydrated. Parents assumed fruit drink meant something healthy, trusting labels that mentioned vitamins while ignoring the sugar content in smaller print. Each cup delivered a rush of sweetness that spiked energy levels before crashing them back down. But when obesity rates climbed and researchers examined what children actually consumed at school, sugary beverages became an obvious target. Federal regulations now strictly limit what schools can serve, permitting only water, plain milk, and 100% fruit juice. The pitchers of Kool-Aid and fruit punch have vanished entirely, replaced by hydration stations that offer nothing but what the body actually needs. Canned ravioli or spaghetti was a blessing in a red sauce-splattered can. It was lunch, dinner, or sometimes a midnight snack, especially if no one felt like cooking. You peeled the lid, dumped the contents into a pot or directly into a bowl, and heated it up until it bubbled and burned your tongue. The noodles were soft, the sauce was sweet, the meat inside the ravioli was questionable, but you ate it anyway. It was hot, it was filling, it was easy. And when you were a kid, it felt like a treat, even if you later learned it was the cheapest thing in the cabinet. Some people doctored it up with cheese, others added hot dogs or leftover ground beef to give it more weight, but most just ate it straight from the can. You could feed a few kids on one can if you served it with white bread and a glass of powdered milk. It had a long shelf life too, meaning it was always there when the fresh stuff ran out. You might roll your eyes at it now, but back then, it was a pantry hero. A can opener, a spoon, and a few minutes on the stove. That was all it took to have a hot meal on a cold night. And in the 1970s, that meant more than anyone wants to admit. Alar treated apple products appeared in pies, turnovers, and juice drinks served at fast food restaurants during the 1970s, preserving the fruit and giving it that perfectly red appearance customers expected. Alar was a growth regulator sprayed on apple orchards to keep fruit on the tree longer and maintain uniform ripeness, and it showed up in processed apple products across the food industry. Families ordered apple desserts believing they were choosing something wholesome, a fruit-based alternative to chocolate and cream. The pies tasted sweet and familiar, the turnovers flaked perfectly, and nobody questioned what had been sprayed on the orchards months earlier. But Alar broke down into a compound that researchers linked to cancer, especially in children who consumed apple products at higher rates relative to their body weight. When the findings became public, panic swept through households and school cafeterias across the country. Regulators banned Alar, growers switched to alternative methods, and fast food apple products were reformulated without the controversial chemical. The scare reshaped how parents thought about processed fruit and left a lasting mark on food safety awareness. Processed hot dogs served every week were a cafeteria ritual that students anticipated with genuine excitement throughout the 1980s. The smell drifted through hallways before lunch started, that unmistakable aroma of salty, smoky meat that signaled something better than the usual fare. Kids lined up eagerly, watching lunch workers use tongs to pluck pink cylinders from warming trays and nestle them into soft white buns. The hot dogs came loaded with nitrates and sodium, preserved with chemicals that extended shelf life, but nobody cared about ingredient lists back then. Squiggles of ketchup and mustard completed the meal, and students devoured them in minutes. Schools loved hot dogs because they were cheap, easy to prepare, and never generated complaints. The tubes of processed meat checked every box that mattered in an era focused on convenience rather than nutrition. But research eventually linked processed meats to health concerns that regulators could not ignore. Nitrates, sodium levels, and overall quality came under scrutiny. Federal guidelines now restrict how often schools can serve processed meats, effectively ending the weekly hot dog tradition. Yoo-hoo was a drink built on nostalgia long before nostalgia became a trend. Its chocolatey flavor was a childhood staple, the kind of sweet, slightly watery treat that made you feel like everything was simpler back then. But the early formula carried a secret: sodium benzoate levels that could become unsafe under heat or improper storage. When the truth came out, it shocked people who had grown up with that yellow bottle as part of their lives. Yoo-hoo wasn't just a drink, it was a summer memory, a lunchbox companion, a reward after mowing the lawn. To learn it could spoil so easily felt like finding out your childhood friend had a dark side. In hot delivery trucks and sunlit store displays, the preservative sometimes reacted to spoil the drink faster than expected. The company faced growing scrutiny, and regulators demanded changes. By the time Yoo-hoo was reformulated, the charm of its golden age had faded a little. Still, for many who grew up in the 50s through the 80s, that yellow bottle remains a symbol of innocence, when a chilled chocolate drink on a summer afternoon could make the whole world feel right again. Unrefrigerated condiment bars lined the walls of fast food restaurants during the 1970s, offering open containers of ketchup, mustard, relish, and mayonnaise-based sauces that sat at room temperature for hours. Customers grabbed plastic spoons and scooped whatever they wanted onto their trays, dipping fries and spreading sauces without considering how long those containers had been sitting out. The setup seemed generous and convenient, a self-serve approach that let families customize their meals without waiting in line. Nobody wore gloves, nobody monitored temperatures, and nobody worried about the occasional fly that landed on the edge of an open tub. But mayonnaise and other creamy sauces spoil quickly without refrigeration, creating ideal conditions for bacterial growth that could send unsuspecting customers home with food poisoning. Health inspectors eventually cracked down, requiring refrigeration, covered dispensers, and single-serve packets that eliminated the contamination risks. The open condiment bar vanished from fast food restaurants, replaced by squeeze bottles and foil-wrapped portions that felt less generous but were infinitely safer. Canned fruit swimming in heavy syrup was a cafeteria staple that made fruit feel like dessert, each spoonful glistening with sugary liquid that pooled at the bottom of the bowl. Peach halves, pear slices, and fruit cocktail arrived in industrial cans that lunch workers opened before portioning the contents into small dishes. The syrup was thick and sweet, the kind of liquid children instinctively drank after finishing the fruit itself. Schools served it proudly because it counted as a fruit serving, checking a nutritional box without requiring the expense of fresh produce. Parents assumed their children were eating something healthy because the word fruit appeared on the menu. But those heavy syrups contained enough added sugar to rival candy, turning what should have been a wholesome choice into something far less innocent. When regulators examined the sugar content hiding in school fruit servings, heavy syrup became an immediate target. Today, canned fruit in schools must be packed in water, natural juice, or light syrup containing a fraction of the sugar children once consumed without question. The fruit tastes different now, less like a treat and more like what it always should have been. Chlorofluorocarbon-propelled whipped cream canisters sat behind fast food counters throughout the 1970s, shooting fluffy white peaks onto sundaes and pies with a satisfying hiss. The propellant inside those metal cans worked perfectly, creating light and airy topping that held its shape beautifully. Workers pressed the nozzle dozens of times per shift, releasing tiny bursts of gas that drifted into kitchen air and eventually into the atmosphere. Nobody worried about what happened after the cream landed on the dessert. The cans were convenient, reliable, and everywhere. but chlorofluorocarbons were silently destroying the ozone layer, creating a global environmental crisis that scientists were only beginning to understand. When the connection became clear, regulators moved aggressively to ban CFCs from consumer products, including the whipped cream dispensers that had become standard equipment in every fast food dessert station. Restaurants switched to alternative propellants, and the familiar hiss changed slightly in ways most customers never noticed. Today, those old CFC canisters represent a strange intersection of innocent dessert toppings and planetary damage. If these forbidden desserts stirred a memory, share your stories in the comments, tap like to help others find the truth, and subscribe so you never miss history behind what we love.